Okay, time for part two. Spent part one kind of giving the backdrop for the discussion on Christian art and music and literature. Now let's start talking about that. This is actually really the timing of this and the way it lays itself out, where you have art following a discussion of the modern age and what that meant for Christianity, is really interesting because examining Christian artwork can be an excellent window into these questions of how has Christianity responded to these shifts. There are a lot of different ways to approach it. There are a lot of different ways to talk about it. I talked about the post-Christian culture. Obviously, you don't want to read too much into that. That's the direction things are going, I would argue. But there's also still a whole lot of Christianity left in the culture. And one of the ways in which you see it pop up quite a lot is through artwork, is through books, music, movies, and so on. There's a lot of artwork that stands around us even now, reminding us in some ways, for lack of a better word, who we used to be. So from the Christian perspective, though, there's some definite questions that come in producing art in the modern age, in the age we live in now, including, do Christian artists have an obligation to produce art that is just for Christian communities? Can you be called a Christian if you're not producing art that's exclusively for the benefit of Christian community? Or is anything not explicitly Christian troublesome? I mean, there is a tradition of thought in Christianity that says basically anything that's not the Bible, any artwork beyond the Bible, any literature beyond the Bible is problematic. I would argue that that itself is a problematic approach because the Bible itself is comprised of artwork. A huge chunk of the Bible is poetry. Beautiful poetry. I mean, go read Isaiah. Stunning poetry. The Psalms. What does it mean to say that artwork doesn't work unless it's scripture? But scripture is artwork too. So how do we do that? There's other approaches as well. There's the approach that says, let's just produce art for the modern culture, and then there's like a lesser version of that. Let's produce art for the larger public, but let's have a Christian message in it, but let's kind of keep it underneath the surface. So people that want, so it's Christian, but is it really Christian? It kind of is, it kind of isn't, but it's definitely not meant for a specific sub-community. It's art for a larger audience, but it has some Christian themes in it. So those are just some of the questions that arise over this issue. But let me start by trying to dig into the stance that I think is that would strike all of us as the most weird. And that's the thing where all artwork is bad. And there is a history of this in Christianity, like I mentioned. I got a quote in my notes. J.I. Packer, who's a very famous Anglican theologian, wrote a book called Knowing God, which is one of the widely regarded as one of the best Christian books of the 20th century. Has this to say: all man-made images of God, whether molten or metal, are really borrowings from the stock and trade of a sinful and ungodly world, and are bound, therefore, to be out of accord with God's holy word. So what he's saying there is that any image that tries to capture God's essence, if you will, it tries to capture God, whether it's painting, it's a statue, whatever, is bound to be idolatrous. Why? Well, let's look at a section of a story in Scripture that'll hopefully give us a sense of where this argument comes from, because a lot of you, I'm guessing, a lot of you read this and I just have no idea what to do with this. Do you remember the golden calf incident in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament? Golden calf, as you recall, Moses gets summoned to the mountain to hang out with God, to get the law, to do all these other stuff. Meanwhile, down below, there's this crazy scene going on where the Israelites make images for themselves. And the text says that they're images of a bull. And they say, "Hear, O Israel, your gods who brought you out of Egypt." Now, when I was growing up, that was pointed to as textbook idolatry, right? The Israelites had gone found some other gods to worship. Um, I don't necessarily think that anymore. Based on some study and some of the stuff I've read, um, I think that when they designed the Israelites and Aaron at the head, um, when they designed the golden calf, they were thinking about their God. They were thinking about um, the God of Israel, if you will. But one of the reasons why what they did was so problematic was because they gave a very incomplete, the technical term, syncretist version of who God is. What's syncretism? Syncretism is essentially worshiping God in a way that is out of accordance with what that God would demand. So in other words, you worship the one true God, but you worship him in not one true God type of ways, if you want to put it that way. And why do I say all this? Well, you think about a calf or a bull. Let's go with a bull. It's more obvious. Um, why does someone make an image? Why does someone fashion an image of their God in the form of a bull? What are they trying? What message are they trying to communicate? What are they trying to convey? It's strength, right? Why do you say my God is like that bull? Well, my God is strong. It would be the same effect if you said, this is, a mighty fortress is our God. What does that mean? Well, it means that, what am I bringing forward? What aspects of God am I conveying? Strength, protection, so on and so forth. So often artwork in this type of style does this very thing. It talks about God, but it uses analogies, right? It tries to capture a sense of who God is. But when the Israelites say, here are your gods that led you out of Egypt, and they give you this bull, and it's a picture of strength and power and vitality. From the perspective of religious orthodoxy, what's the problem there? Isn't God all of those things? Isn't God the picture of strength? Isn't God the picture of vitality? Well, yes, of course. But is that all he is? Or is he not more than that? So the J.I. Packers of the world, they look at this and say, they say the problem is, it's not that God isn't strong, but you're saying God is strong, but you're not doing him justice because he's a whole lot more than strong. He's also wise, he's loving, he's all of these other things, which you cannot hope to convey in your flawed, imperfect image of God that you're using in your artwork. So this is where somebody like Packer's coming from, and this is why he would even advocate, the cross in church. No, it's problematic. Why is it problematic? Because it focuses on an aspect of Jesus' story, but doesn't focus on the whole thing. What does the cross represent? Excuse me, I'm ducking out of the picture here for a minute. What does the cross represent? Well, the cross represents Jesus' death, right? But if you focus exclusively on his death, then you don't get the full picture of the power of his resurrection. Your theology is incomplete because your artwork is incomplete, because no artwork can capture God as he truly is, can capture the enormity of the Jesus story, if you will. So this is definitely a minority viewpoint, and this is not my viewpoint. It's a minority viewpoint, but it's a point that I wanted to put you in contact with, because some people, when they look at this, they say, where is he coming from? I'm trying to give you a picture of where somebody like Packer's coming from. Because if you try to add stuff to the biblical message, you're inevitably going to fall short because you can't capture the enormity of it. That's kind of the thought there. Obviously, many other Christians, most Christians, would disagree. Most significantly, Catholics and Orthodox. Because these traditions are built on the idea, especially the Orthodox tradition, but also Catholics, the whole notion of icons. What's an icon? It's an object of veneration. Well, does that mean we worship the icon? No, the icon is a means by which you worship that which is actually personified in the icon. So I worship Jesus. I don't worship the little statue of Jesus, but the statue is the way in which I engaged with Jesus to worship him. So you can see how this is dramatically, on the opposite end, it's opposite to what somebody like Packer, who's Anglican, who's Reformed, who comes very much out of the Puritan tradition, um, it's an opposite take on what somebody like that would say. But with the Catholics and the Orthodox, and most of it, there is at least some role for Christian art. So if there's some role for Christian art, then what does it look like? I mean, you run the risk of, if you say, all right, we're going to allow art, but it's got to be sufficiently Christian. It's got to be obviously Christian. It really, in its appeal, it appeals to Christians. It's not really appealing to people outside the church community. That's a very popular stance, and there's a lot of quote-unquote Christian art, Christian music, Christian literature. I'm thinking of things like the Left Behind novels. I'm thinking of things like contemporary Christian music. I'm thinking of things that are specifically for the Christian community, and they are marked by being obviously, explicitly Christian. How could that be a bad thing? Well, some folks have come and said, yeah, that's fine and good, I suppose, but what you do when you do this, when you say we're going to come up with our own forms of music, with our own forms of artwork, with our own forms of literature, is what you do is you build what they call the Christian ghetto. And I've given you, and this is optional, you don't need to read them, they're interesting, you should, but I've given you a couple of articles, links to a couple of articles here that describe this idea of the Christian ghetto, this idea of if Christians only listen to Christian music and watch Christian movies and pay attention to Christian artwork, then you voluntarily segregate yourselves. You cut yourselves off from the larger conversations of culture, and you miss a lot of what's happening. You willfully segregate yourselves. You willfully put yourselves in second-rate status. We have this article from the Colson Center, Charles Colson. We also have this article on C.S. Lewis and how C.S. Lewis didn't do that. And there's a quote that I've given you here from that article. What matters the most is that Lewis set out to write books that were good enough to be read by bright people, young and old, all across England and then around the world. He did not set out to be a popular Christian writer. He set out to be a great writer, to produce what he called popular little books who appealed for everyone. As people say in the American South, Lewis didn't settle for preaching to the choir. So you have an alternative view. We'll get into this view in a little bit more detail in a minute. But what this article is comparing Lewis to is the person who sets out to write a Christian novel, or the person who sets out to make Christian music, or Christian art. I mean, you have stuff in it, and what you end up having is this kind of, and that quote really gets to it when it says, didn't set out to be a popular Christian writer, he set out to be a great writer. What's the difference? When you set out to be a great Christian writer, more often than not, what you're doing is aping the culture that's already out there. And I have this article from Relevant Magazine, it's the definitive ranking of Christian T-shirts. If you grew up in youth group culture, I don't know if it's still like this, but if you grew up in youth group culture, then you know the Christian T-shirt, and you know how it would happen. You would have a very popular logo, but you would have the wording, a popular like consumer corporate logo, but the wording would change to reflect a Christian message. My all-time favorite. I saw this at a Christian music festival once, which is kind of similar to our conversation. Green shirt. From a distance, I thought it was a Mountain Dew shirt. It had the Mountain Dew logo, but the words were different. And I walked closer and I said, "What is this shirt?" And the writing on the shirt, not line, the writing on the shirt, "Do the Jew." Do the Do was kind of the Mountain Dew slogan for a long time. Do the Jew. I just stared at it. That is the most over-the-top, obnoxious, ridiculous thing I've ever seen. But it is this idea, right? So you're taking stuff that has succeeded, stuff that's already out there in the rest of the world, and you're kind of bringing it into your Christian ghetto. And T-shirts, it's kind of a stupid example, but it's a good example of what that process looks like. So you have, and if you talk about Christian music, for example, I saw that shirt at a Christian music festival. How do you, if you go to a Christian music festival and you don't know your way around Christian music, do you know how they orient you? Yeah, hey, I want to see this band. Oh, they're a great band. They sound like this band. Oh, you want to go see them? They sound like U2, or they sound like The Roots. They sound like Tom Petty. And they sound like the Grateful Dead. It's a derivative culture. You're taking stuff that works for the larger audience and you're deriving it for the Christian culture. and you're reducing it down, and it loses something along the way. So yeah, so it's but this is an argument that's ongoing because there because the opposite part of that argument is, well, is there not a place for in-house stuff? Can we not have music that we appreciate or art that we appreciate that the larger world might not appreciate? And that's an ongoing debate because you have people like Lewis who say, you know what, I didn't set out to write Christian books. I set out to write really good books that happen to be Christian. And the other end of the spectrum is we set out to write Christian material, and if it's good or not, great. But the more important, is it Christian? It's a very different. It's a highly different way of thinking. It's a highly different way of philosophy. And the Lewis's take lines up with how McGrath outlines Augustine's take. He says that Augustine argued for a critical appropriation of classical culture. What does that mean? It means you take that which is good in the world and you put it to use for the gospel. Another way to say this is you take advantage of prevenient grace. It's a Wesleyan term. Methodists still use it. It means the grace which comes before. What does that mean? This assumes that there is, truth, beauty, and goodness are present in the world, and what you're doing with this technique is you're finding it and you're putting it to use for the gospel. So in Augustine's case, for example, he can look back at somebody like Plato. Is Plato a Christian author? No. He's not Christian at all. He is he holds to a ancient Greek religious structure. But somebody like Augustine could look at Plato and go, man, he was right on a lot of things, and pull him into his Christian philosophy, pull him into his Christian theology. Take what works in him, what he got right, and put it to the service of the gospel. So if you go outside of artwork, for example, if there is if there's a book that maybe not explicitly Christian, but there's a lot of continuity between what the author writes and what you're trying to do as a Christian, well then, yeah, use it. This happens all the time. This happens. Take the issue of human trafficking, for instance. There have been a lot of books written, and one of the first books written on this issue that really got everybody's attention was a book called Not for Sale. It was written by a journalist named David Batstone. Batstone's not a believer, but he had quite an audience in Christian communities because it was absolutely in tune with what they were trying to do in dealing with this human trafficking issue. So he ended up getting a lot of speaking engagements to Christian conferences and things of that nature. Why? Because he's on the same page. And from the Christian perspective, they were looking at somebody like Batstone saying, he's right about a lot of things. Let's put that to use to strengthen our efforts on this issue as well. So you have this critical appropriation of classical culture. Let's see what is true, good, and beautiful in the world and put it to use for the gospel. Martin Luther did this. I mentioned "Mighty Fortress is Our God." It's a famous hymn. Martin Luther actually wrote it. He wrote the lyrics to "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." He took the melody from a popular German drinking song, a song sang at the bar while people were getting hammered. And legend says that when Luther did it and was asked about it, he said, "Why should the devil have all the good music? This melody is good. I'm going to use it. I'm going to appropriate it for the purposes of the gospel." So again, it's a very different way of looking at it, but you think of a conversation about artwork. What is artwork designed to do? Well, on one level, if it's good artwork, it's going to connect with us. It's going to connect with what's true, what's beautiful, what's good. It is going to ring those bells. And that's true whether that piece of art is Christian or not. So from the perspective of Augustine, his Christian perspective, he says, well, let's take what's out there, what already meets these criteria, and put it to the larger service of the gospel. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. But then you have the issue, of the medium versus the message, and this kind of gets at the heart of some of these things. You have the gospel, and then you have artwork that deals with Christianity. You have artwork that's connected to Christianity. McGrath has this really fascinating story. He says, Geoffrey Chaucer, the medieval author, had an apology in his book for his quote-unquote worldly vanity. What did that mean? He basically apologized for writing well. the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5. And so it was with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was in you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. He says all that. He says, I'm not coming to you with eloquence or human wisdom, but he's using eloquence to make the point that he's not coming with eloquence. He's using argument to make the point that he's not really that much of an arguer. He's persuading you that his message is not about using persuasive words. Do you see the paradox here? So some of the larger issues that complicate the art issue. It's like, what is the ultimate goal? Is it to be faithful for the Christian artist? Is it to be faithful to Christianity, or is it to be excellent in the artwork? What matters more? It's not an easy question, because on the one hand, you have the people that say, we're doing this for the purpose of the gospel, and if quality suffers as a result, oh well. Then you have other people that say, well, if quality suffers, then it's not of God. If the quality suffers, it's not an adequate representation of our awesome God. So you can't sacrifice quality to have a more explicit Christian message. And these are the positions, and this is how this is how this debate works itself out. So how do you move your way? How do you make a way forward in all this? C.S. Lewis, McGrath quotes C.S. Lewis talking about the baptized imagination. What does that mean? You're communicating Christian truths, but you're doing it in bold and imaginative ways, but you're also not doing it in ways that are just over the top, explicit. You're letting the truths, you're letting your reader find these truths rather than just trying to jam it down their throats. And this is the criticism for most Christian movies that get released. This is one of the criticisms. Another one's the bad acting. But one of the criticisms of Christian movies, and when I say Christian movies, I mean the Fireproofs of the world, the Facing the Giants of the world, the Kirk Cameron stuff. One of the persistent criticisms of this type of movie making, of this type of artwork, is that it is unsubtle. It comes down with the force of a blunt hammer. It's not letting the viewer find these truths organically. It's shoving it down their throats. And McGrath's argument is that C.S. Lewis does not do that. And he uses the example of Eustace in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And it's a beautiful sequence. Go back and read it. But the point that McGrath is making is he's communicating Christian truths, but he's doing it in bold, imaginative ways. And he's doing it in ways where he's not spelling everything out. He's leaving some mystery. But at the same time, it's unmistakable, the message that gets taken away. So, but now the question is, how explicit do you have to be? And I mentioned YouTube before, and they are the poster boy for this conversation. Because there's so much disagreement as to whether, are they a Christian band, and why or why not? And I'm actually asking you to deal with this in your discussion this week. But I want to know, do you think U2 is a Christian band? Do you think that they fit the criteria of Christian? Are they explicit enough? Are they Christian enough? If so, then what's the difference between a band like U2 and a contemporary Christian music band like Casting Crowns or Chris Tomlin? What separates the two? And if you don't think U2 is Christian, then how would they need to change in order to become a Christian band? So there's this really interesting article in the New Yorker. I'm asking you to read it and then basing your judgment on that. But the point of the matter is, when it comes to this idea of Christian artwork, there's a lot of differences of opinion. But it's something we need to wrestle with, because artwork, music, literature is a prime. Well, I assigned you literature this semester, right? And I've assigned you short stories, another form of literature, at the end of the semester. Why? Because through the years, it's been a really powerful way of getting to some of the truths of the Christian religion. So even this week, I gave you Flannery O'Connor. I'll give you more next week. But I want you to read A Good Man is Hard to Find this week. And while you're reading it, I want you to think about which truths of the Christian, what Christian truths is she trying to communicate, and how does she go about doing it? It's another story that's not altogether pleasant. There's violence, there's murder, there's really unpleasant people that claim the name of God. All of this is intentional. She is trying to say something about God, about Christianity, and about people who claim the faith. And I want you to see if you can figure out what it is. But she's doing it not in a, I'm going to sit down and shut up, I got some things to tell you, but doing it in the form of a story and letting these truths kind of unfold so that they unfold with more power and more influence than they otherwise would. Because you know what? People forget sermons, and people forget essays, and people forget classes like this one. What do they remember? They remember experiences that engage their emotions as well as their head, and that is Christian art. It engages your head through your emotional capacities. I mean, that is poetry, that's artwork, that's literature, all of it. And it's been one of the major ways in which Christians, in the Christian community as a whole, has dealt with the overly rational sensibilities of the Enlightenment. If the Enlightenment says we're all cognitive beings, Christian artists come along and say, that's not all there is. There's more. Again, there's more to it than that. And I'm going to engage your emotions, and I'm going to tell you a story, and you're going to be sucked in, and you're going to be profoundly more effective than if I just laid out logical proofs for you. So it's worth paying attention to.